And that's partly because of the nature of debt. I mean, I think that we misunderstand the nature of money and debt. The essence of money, the banknotes you have in your pocket, is that they represent a debt to you from the state, and essentially from the public realm. They are a promise to you that in the future you're going to be able to consume a certain amount relative to what you are sacrificing now in terms of labor or goods. What you have then in an economy as a whole is the public debt is a relationship that is set up between the future growth which the economy will enjoy and the future prosperity of the economy and what is necessary now to make that future possible. So that's the essence of public debt, and the reason for public debt is that it is essentially agreeing to expand the money supply, to expand activity on the basis of what you know will be the result of this in the future in terms of economic growth. Next slide, please. Could someone get me a little glass of water, please? Now, do cuts make the bond markets like you? Well, here's what we know. Now, you think, of course, that they say that make a cut because this is actually going to make the bond markets like Britain better and reduce the price of borrowing. This is not anybody's experience. And what we know from emerging market debt, that's to say in Latin America, is that improving credit worthiness by reducing deficits and introducing quote-unquote needed reforms, I left the quotation out, has limited effect. And instead, all you have in emerging market debt is a correlation with the spread between treasury bond and junk bonds in the US domestic market. Essentially what you have is this wall of American money being generated by the treasury for reasons I'll explain in a moment, and which is essentially driving the price of the international capital markets. And what you have is essentially a kind of leverage between what is considered to be ultra-safe debt, US treasury debt, versus speculative debts of various kinds. And that's essentially a domestic market spread, which is then globalized. In concrete terms, we can turn to the Irish experience that extremely strict cuts in 2008 have generated a deeper collapse by 2010. And you may note, too, that the announcement of the bailout last week led, in fact, to a collapse in the price of Irish bonds, a rise in their yields. So that there's no evidence, in other words, you can't make the bond markets, you can't placate the bond markets, you can beat them into shape and remind them who's boss. That ultimately people and the states are bosses, and the money markets are purely our servants. The next slide, please. So what is there is a climate crisis, and this crisis is connected to that post-1970 neoliberal experiment. I mean, there is a long-term crisis of the non-financial British and US economies. This has to do with the crisis of manufacturing, underinvestment in a variety of areas of social capital, high levels of structural unemployment and underemployment, declining US and UK export competitiveness, deindustrialization, high levels of personal and corporate debt, long-term wage decline. This is a critical thing, that one of the achievements of the neoliberals in the 1970s and 80s was to restrict the capacity of trade unions to organize and to make it easier for management to wrest from trade unions better and better settlements. So that in long term, in terms of real wages in the US and the UK for ordinary workers reached their peak in the 1970s, and they have been on decline ever since. That has incredible knock-on consequences. So anyway, this is essentially a kind of, our own crisis now is the extension of a post-1980 term, which in a way has been obscured by the cheap cost of capital, and also in the UK case by the North Sea oil windfall. But in 2006, UK becomes a net importer. So we've had, according to the newspapers a month ago, a small economic recovery. But what does this economic recovery really involve? It involves, if you look carefully, public sector-led construction, Olympics, Crossrail, all these kinds of new labour, reflationary state projects, which have actually been involved in any kind of upturn in the budget. And in the US, what we've seen is simply asset inflation. Asset inflation is what happens when you drive a lot of cheap capital into the market and you don't actually redistribute it. So people go chasing assets. Let's go to the next slide. Cheap money. failed option. But it's the only option which they're playing. What they do when there's an economic downturn, they've been doing this since the 1980s, is they don't try to increase wages. They don't try to increase the capacity of ordinary people to live and to consume. What they do is they pass on more money to the bankers. What they've done in this case, what it's now called, this is translated from the Japanese, effectively, quantitative easing. Japan's been doing it since the 80s with minimal effect. It means essentially where the central bank buys up its own debt and to drive up the price, drive down the yield, does the same to corporate debt. What it's doing essentially is providing a great transfer of money from the public realm into private bondholders' hands. This has had little impact. What it's done has been to drive up the price of real assets. So the United States recently announced QE2, quantitative easing 2, an extra $600 billion into the capital market. But again, with minimal results. Now, Keynes warned about this. Keynes wrote about something called the liquidity trap. He says, what would happen, in fact, in an economy where all you did was to pump lots of cheap capital in? What you end up with is this kind of gluey marsh through which nothing actually moves very fast because people are drowning in money. That's the situation of the economy at the moment. The rich have too much money. They are oversaving, and they're oversaving via financial instruments which are non-productive and which are not generating real economic activity. So we have money whizzing around the world, generating virtual profits, which has no relationship to real productive life. No relationship to employment, no relationship to actual social well-being. However, as we can see from The Guardian yesterday, sales of £1 million homes in London soared by 44% over the last year. Isn't that amazing? At the same time as there have been freezes on wages of public sector and private sector salaries, in fact, wages being driven down, what we have is a lot of money going around the world chasing assets. And so we have these little stock market recoveries. We have high prices paid at auctions for art, for postage stamps, for coins, for gold, because there's money chasing assets. They're trying to make this fictional wealth real in as many ways as possible. And mark my words, what's involved in these financial cuts is essentially an extension of an attempt to make the fictional wealth created over the last 20 years real at our future expense. Next slide. So how did we get here? A short guide to neoliberalism. Beginning with where I began, 1914 to 45, we see a collapse. No, back to the other side, you just ran. We see a collapse of confidence in the power of capitalism to govern itself. And to provide either perpetual peace, since this is an era of 2 world wars, fought by capitalist powers, or universal abundance. This is a period of enormous unemployment, dearth, and suffering. This leads to the rise of a new kind of economic and political economic vision in which the state would play a key role in making economic prosperity and social well-being. Also at the same time in the interwar period, we have something very different from our contemporary globalization. We have the League of Nations via the ILO arguing that what should be spread around the world is not in fact the most favorable business conditions, but the most favorable labor conditions in order to prevent illiberal social dumping. So on the best liberal grounds, the argument was made that labor rights should be high, working hours should be limited, labor should have economic and other kinds of insurance in order to ensure that these benefits would be spread around the world and that no economy would displace another because it paid its workers worse. So what we had was a kind of globalization of human rights. And as I said, that after 1945, we must remember this, that human rights meant the right to employment, to food, to housing, to health, to education. And that Labour government of 1945 to 51, the greatest government this country has ever had, in a period in which national debt was over 200% in its relationship to GDP, created the foundations of the welfare state, created the National Health Service, expanded the scale and scope of public education, expanded public housing to historical levels, provided fuel and food subsidies, and created the context for Britain's remarkable economic recovery in the 1950s and 60s. Next slide. Now, Susan George, I probably shouldn't, actually I do have a bit of time. Susan George, 1945, wrote that 1945 or 1950, if you'd seriously proposed any of the ideas and policies in today's standard neoliberal toolkit, you would have been laughed off the stage or sent off to the insane asylum. At least in the Western countries at that time, everyone was a Keynesian, a social democrat, or a social Christian democrat, or some shade of Marxist. The idea that the market should be allowed to make major social and economic decisions, the idea that the state should voluntarily reduce its role in the economy, or that corporations should be given total freedom, the trade unions should be curbed and citizens given much less rather than more social protection, such ideas were utterly foreign to the spirit of the time. Even if someone actually agreed with these ideas, he or she would have hesitated to take such a position in public and would have had a hard time finding an audience. Now, what is the difference between the state and private economic activity? The nature of the state is it involves a permanent commitment to the experience of a nation, an intergenerational commitment. What you have, the government is able to plan in very long-term ways, to plan for 40 or 50 or 100-year cycles. The essence of private enterprise is it is supposed to turn a profit in the short term. And this is turned to the extreme in the neoliberal experiment. What we have now in the world is an economy in which there's a class of managers who essentially are hired, and they know that they're probably only going to be with a company for 3 to 5 years. And they've got to increase share value within 3 to 5 years, or they have to appear to do so. The entire arrangement of economic life is now governed by extremely short-term decision-making. This is exactly, of course, what is being applied to the deficit. That in fact there should be some kind of short-term solution to public debt. The time cycle of government activity allows for the creation of structures which require generations of investment. And this is essentially what we are partly fighting for and against, the protection of a different scale of organization and planning of social life. Next slide. Keynesianism 45 to 76. Now, this is making a big story very short. We have significant state intervention in the industry, economic and social planning, restrictions on the capital markets. You look at any area of British economic success after the Second World War, whether it's in aviation sales, Rolls-Royce engines, Concorde, BAE. If you look at pharmaceuticals, Wellcome, what are the other big British companies? ICI and its subsidiaries. These are all based on the massive public investment in science and technology which happened after the Second World War. All private corporations live off a massive, massive public subsidy that goes into the maintenance of particularly science and technology investment. But this begins in this period. Oxford and Cambridge colleges, many of them were nearly bankrupt before the Second World War. What saves them is actually state subsidies for university education. I was told this by one of my colleagues at Corpus, that essentially Corpus before the war had less than 10 fellows. They couldn't afford more relative to their income. And essentially what you have is a massive expansion of colleges and of universities around Britain, but I'm talking specifically about our work in terms of these, on the basis of public expenditure. So major state intervention leading to all sorts of odd and interesting consequences. It's a period of extraordinary economic growth around the world. In France, this is called the 30 années glorieuses. In Germany, this is the period of the Wirtschaftswunder. In Britain, this is the period of the recovery from complete devastation of the Second World War. This is a period of growth not just in the First World, but in the Third World. Africa experiences positive GDP growth in the period from 1960 to 80. Latin America enjoys significant growth. I'll talk about this in a moment. It's a period of declining inequality. In 1928, the top 1% of the population took 23% of the income in the United States. 1940 to 84, they took less than 15%. And indeed, in the 15 years from 1965 to 80, the top 1% took less than 10% of the national wealth. Today, of course, they now take about close to 30% of the national income. And that all of these gains in terms of inequality, and the United States and Britain have moved lockstep in this way, have to a certain extent been reversed. The Keynesian model was a victim of its success. Industrial